welcome to the Assent. It's so great to have you here, Nick. How are you tonight?
I'm doing pretty good. That was a pretty snazzy intro for Meaning of Catholic. I'm
Thank
used to
you.
just nice classical music in the morning. I was like, oh, okay, welcome to the late night show.
I'm
Let's
I'm
go.
sorry. This is a late night show, and if you're watching, I hope you have a drink. And if you don't drink, that's fine too. But I kind of have a reputation for liking my old fashions, so here we are.
Hey, that's cool.
Um,
That's cool.
I'm really excited to chat with you. I feel like we've done Avoiding Babylon's trivia show together, and we're in group chats together, but I haven't had a chance to talk to you one-on-one. And of course, I saw some comments you made on Dr. Peter Kwasniewski's Facebook post a few days ago, and I thought, you know what? I want to have Nicholas on to talk about the SSPX and some of these other things, because you brought up a really great point in that we're not talking about the important things, and it just feels like we're slinging stuff at each other all the time. And this isn't really the important stuff right now in the church. So before we dive into that conversation, first I want to say to anyone listening, please like, subscribe, share this. And if you like what the Meaning of Catholic is doing, maybe consider becoming a guild member. They're kind enough to let both of us come on here and just talk to people about stuff. And I think,
hmm
I don't know, I'll speak for myself in saying that, first of all, I'm really honored to be a part of the Meaning of Catholic. It's just, there's not an apostolate like it, where we get to have conversations, even among each other, where we might disagree on some things, but we walk away assuming good intentions and having charitable discussion, because our goal here is to really build up families, to build up parents, and to cultivate faith in a way that is expounding on virtue and drawing people closer to God, like helping cultivate holiness within the home. So thank you guys for joining us tonight. And I guess, do you have anything to add to that before we kind of dive in?
Yeah, that was a way better intro than I could have ever gotten to a Meaning of Catholic video.
Oh,
So you're killing it.
thanks. I appreciate it. Hey, it's really nice to see some of you guys. Thanks for joining us tonight. These are your working hours. Oh, yep, I bet. So, okay, Lauren, here's a little shout out and a plug. Lauren and I have been doing some collaborating. And if you follow my work over at Integrator or not, maybe you're new to what I'm doing. But Lauren over at Star of the Sea Gifts, she and I have a collaboration going. So if you would like to support my show or the work that I'm doing, you can go over and buy something and use the code integrated10 on her Etsy shop, and you will get 10% off and you'll support what I'm doing. So definitely appreciate that. But anyway, to the subject matter tonight. So would you mind talking about what that post was? Let's use that as kind of the starting point here, because I do want to talk about what's going on with the SSPX and kind of a little bit about that. I want to maybe explain why this is controversial, but apart from that, the bigger picture. What is the bigger picture? So let's first talk about that post. What was Dr. Kwasniewski saying in that post, and how did you respond?
Yeah, so I'll put it to you this way. Keeping in mind, I guess, our internet rules of promise, I'll put it this way. So Dr. Kwasniewski was commenting on a recent kind of debate that's been going on online regarding the SSPX, their canonical status, whether or not one can go and fulfill their Sunday obligation at an SSPX chapel or not. And he was just giving some of his opinions on it. And I really highly recommend the audience just to go and just pick up really any of the books of Dr. Peter Kay. His work is just phenomenal.
Yes, I
Whether
love
that
his book, Reclaiming Your Roman Birthright, I think is what its title is. An excellent book. Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. No, there's that one. There's one of his recent books that just recently came out. It's a massive tome. I think it's called something like 70 Years in Exile, like Reclaiming the Roman Right. It's or the Once and for All Roman Right. So it's phenomenal. Plus, he also has, for people who are interested, some works on St. Thomas Aquinas. So he has, I think he releases his doctrinal dissertation on St. Thomas Aquinas and the theology behind ecstasy, which is a very interesting portion of mystical life regarding the levels of prayer. And so it's very interesting work. So yeah, just go and pick up some of his stuff or just listen to his talks here on YouTube. But he was making some comments that I was agreeing with, that I just thought that, yeah, he was not just right on, but I kind of bemoaned, right? I kind of bemoaned the situation that at least the church online, I kind of perceive it is. Yeah, once and future. Thank you. And I was bemoaning this fact that we're spending all of this time debating questions regarding the SSPX, which has been going on since the SSPX has been born, right? This argument
Right.
seems like it's
Right from its
old as dirt.
inception. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right from its inception. And not that the debate shouldn't take place, not that there shouldn't be questions that should be levied at the feet of the SSPX and then back. But what I was bemoaning was this reality that we live in a day and age where it seems that we're focusing an inordinate amount of time on these issues when it comes to traditionalism, when on the flip side, we have bishops' conferences, say, for instance, the Finnish Bishops' Conference in Belgium releasing an official promulgated prayer that blesses homosexual unions, quote unquote. And we have obviously the German Synodal Path, which you just read any of their documents that they promulgate, and they are not just problematic, but downright even heretical when it comes to notions of the moral life of the Catholic. So we see these, and then we also see not just that, but also classic ambiguous things coming from the See of Rome, including things along the nature of putting, a pro-abortion
Yes, thank
feminist
you.
atheist on the Pontifical
Yeah.
Academy of Life. So we see all this going on, but then we see the conversation is so small. It's kind of like we acknowledge it, almost kind of like, yeah, I recognize my car was hit, but oh well. And then we just kind of go on, right? It's just kind of this really weird thing. It's like we almost expect at this point bad stuff to happen, but rather than discussing it, rather than even uniting all Catholics of goodwill against the enemies of Holy Mother Church, rather than doing that, we just spend our time nitpicking and fighting amongst ourselves of whether this person's a schismatic or this person's a heretic or this person's not hyper qualified or uncharitable or imprudential or everything else. And
Yeah. Do
so,
you, do you feel like those words like heretical and schismatic are sort of, they're kind of like racism now, right? Like it's a Catholic form of racism. It's like, it's almost as if it has no meaning anymore because it's so ubiquitously used and misused that it has lost all meaning.
yeah, I say to a degree, absolutely, because it's like, and maybe this is just me, since I really push for academic excellence in myself, it's kind of like I'm always very careful to use when I use the term heretical, because it's like when I think of the word heretical now, I think of, oh, yes, this is the theological censor against somebody openly denying a divinely revealed proposition of faith that the church is specifically dogmatized, like something to that effect. That's what I think. But I think online, the term heretic really just means like you said something that I don't like.
Right.
And this is a problem even with some of my own camp, right? And so, whether you guys could tell from the title of my name or not, the traditional Thomist, like I am a traditionalist in the classic sense of the term, but I think that there's a lot of traditionalists that definitely do that, right? Throw that term heretical around, or even the term modernist around, way
Right.
too loose, way
Yes.
too.
Well, and I think that's something that needs to be addressed because I too would consider myself more of a traditionalist bent. I don't know. It depends on what circle I'm running in because I'm sure some people would say I'm not a true traditionalist. I sometimes I wear pants, like things like that. I just feel like there's always this litmus test, and some people I will never accept me a part of this group because I don't follow completely in that group think. And I don't know if I don't know when we're going to come to terms with this or if this is just the state of human beings since the dawn of time. I mean, I think there's this
Mhm.
tendency for tribalism. It's a survival mechanism, right? That's
Yeah.
kind of a human anthropological component of
Mhm.
existence, right? But at what point do we say this church is universal? And that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to look the exact same for everybody. And when are we going to stop eating our own, people who should be on our own team, so to speak, and start addressing some of these bigger problems within the church? I mean, it's clear we have an issue, and it feels as if we're spending more time creating content that is just attacking our fellow trads than
Mhm.
looking at some of the bigger pictures and assuming goodwill in people. Like, what are some of the
Mhm.
things that you think would be helpful for bringing a better conversation about, for example, we're using the SSPX right now because it's kind of the hot issue right now after Pope Benedict's death. May
Mhm.
he rest in peace. I just feel like that's really the big reason we're talking about it tonight. But in reality,
Mhm.
it'll be something new next week. right? Like it will be
Yeah.
some other controversy in a week. And that's the problem. The problem isn't always necessarily the issues that we're seeing, rather that we're attacking each other over these things that we really objectively don't have much of a say in. So what are
Mm-hmm.
some virtues that you think we should be striving for as Catholics to cultivate real conversation and real dialogue about some of these things?
Mm-hmm. So the virtue that I would point to, which is just it's almost a meme now, at least in my own circles, but would be the virtue of charity, is actual charity. But what does that mean? So it's like I did an episode yesterday, right, for the Monday
It was
morning show
great.
on
Mm-hmm.
what is charity, and even so much that I could have more said, but fundamentally it's like charity is that virtue in our will, right, that is connecting us to have friendship with God. It's loving God for loving God as he ought to be loved, and loving our neighbor as ourselves for the love of God. But what does that even mean? Because sometimes, like I said yesterday, sometimes when we hear that word charity, we use it kind of as a blanket term to almost get away with things that we shouldn't be
Mm-hmm.
doing, or to accuse another person of not having charity because we feel called out, and maybe we do need to be called out, or maybe we don't. It just depends on the moment. And so what I would say, so charity, right, is this mean where it's in the middle between, on the one hand, not saying anything, right? Charity does have to say something, and charity does not even necessarily have to be nice, right? Charity does sometimes have to be very rough and rebuke, right? I mean, we look at our Lord as
Right.
the epitome of charity, and he's not just, when he goes into the temple, he doesn't say, well, let me just sit down and start dialoguing with every single,
That's kind of
seller of gold.
ecumenism, right? Like this kind of
Yeah.
how
Mhm.
ecumenism is today. It's very much like, let me accompany you without calling you to more or
Mhm.
calling you home, right? It's sort of, yeah,
Mhm.
I think you're right there in that sometimes charity
Yeah.
does mean directness on the
Mhm.
person, on the part of the person communicating.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you want to communicate with somebody, truth, but then on the other end of the spectrum, you wanna do it in a way in which one is becoming to truth, right? But then also it depends on the moment, but you can talk to that person in a manner which respects their own human dignity, right, as another fellow human being, right? It's going to be something that is going to lead the other person into truth, and hopefully you and them into greater unity. And so
Right.
for us, if we're wanting to have unity inside of the body of Christ, which we should all strive for, then we need to, on the one hand, have difficult conversations. But see, this is the thing, the difficult conversations need to be, at least first and foremost, with each other. So, as an example, on my show,
Mm,
Traditional Thomist, I don't make expose videos, right? I don't do that. I don't make
right.
videos where I'm calling out other people in the context of, I think that this X, Y, or Z commentator is doing bad things. Mainly because, one, unless it's something very blatant, like, hypothetically, such and such YouTuber gets up and just says, Christ is not the Son of God, unless it's something very blatant like that, where he has a lot of influence, he or she has a lot of influence inside of the church, I would say no. Like, I would rather approach them as a brother, right? If we
Mm-hmm.
disagree, and start to dialogue with that person, right? And take humility, let that be the route, because I could be wrong. They could be wrong, but let's discuss and let's have a true dialogue for each other. I'm not going to make a 50-part installment on somebody just because I don't like it. So I would say charity, number one. And then the second, and this would be my other one, which would be humility. We have to
Mm,
see each other as we are, right? Which means we have to see each other as God sees us. Now, we're good in our nature, we're good in our being, but we
right.
are incredibly flawed, and very much so bent. We have a strong propensity that's bent toward evil, right? And so pride is seeing ourselves in an inordinate fashion, in an inordinate light. And so we have to ask the Lord, Lord, give me your eyes to see myself. Doesn't mean that we go off into the other end of the spectrum and into the world of pusillanimity, and we're just kind of like, yeah, I'm just this terrible person. God doesn't love me. No one loves me. It's not that. Rather, it's just saying, okay, my existence comes from God. He sustains me now. And
Mm,
everything that is good comes from God. My life of grace comes from God. And therefore, I ought to walk and recognize that I could fall if God does not hold me up. And therefore, I should want other people, right, to be lifted up above me, right, and put them before me. What does Christ say? He says, if anyone will be great in the kingdom of God, right? This is kind of almost for all of us content creators who want to, quote unquote, be big online. If anyone wants to be great in the kingdom of God, let him become a servant. How many creators are truly being servants and saying, let me wash the feet of those who are about to abandon me? Or are we just going to say, no, I'm going to exalt myself? What does scripture say? It says, he that exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted.
Well,
And so charity and humility, those are going to be the big two things.
You know, that's such a good point. It makes me think of Pope St. John Paul II's to service to reign. You know, I mean, he says that, I believe, in Mulieris Dignitatem, and of course, that's something I've read because I'm a woman, and I feel like that document is so insightful. However people feel about, I can't even believe sometimes I have to qualify this, but however you feel about Pope St. John Paul II, a lot of his writing on women in the church today was so precise and accurate. And two, I just feel like we live in this time where we are prone to our own echo chambers, right? We get to cultivate our own echo chambers online by following the people we agree with, and they get to follow us, and they get to repeat back to us the things that we're saying into the internet. And so then when we encounter in real life people who disagree with us and they push back, it's like we have this aversion to it so strongly, I think more so now than ever before, because before we had this ability in social media to create sort of these little mini worlds. Like Catholic Twitter is notorious, we have our own weird little corner of Twitter, and but in the real world it's not like that, and we need to have real dialogue that's not focused on straw manning people that we just don't agree with on something for clicks, right? Because sometimes it does. I feel like there's a stereotype of having this grifter. I feel like sometimes it does, and I get it. I think sometimes, that's a temptation when you see something is getting a lot of attention to sort of look at why it's getting a lot of attention and then continue to do those things, right? Because there is kind of that physiological response in the brain where you are getting those little doses of serotonin and endorphins, and it makes you feel good, all those dopamine hits, and all of a sudden, maybe you don't like the way that you've been behaving, So what do you think then about this? I mean, what do you think about the SSPX debate? Because I kind of was telling you before the show, I haven't done all my research on that specifically because I don't know. I feel like it's not as much, I don't want to say worth my time. I think this is an important conversation. I just feel like sometimes the conversation is pretty hyperbolic or disingenuous between people on both sides. So it's hard for me to discern what the truth is. And so I just back away from it totally. But I have a feeling you've probably studied it a little bit more than I have. So what is your take, on the situation at large, and how do you recommend people approach it? Because I see here, even in our chat, we have people who are very supportive of the SSPX and attend the SSPX. And I'm not saying you guys are wrong. I don't understand it enough to make a pronouncement one way or another. And I feel like the church maybe hasn't really made a pronouncement against the SSPX. So I'm not really opposed to it personally. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah. So let me do two things. My principle always, especially as a Thomist, is try to steel man the opponent's argument.
Thank you. That's my favorite.
Yeah, so let me first do this for the viewers. I'm going to show my cards at the beginning so that you guys can feel like I'm not duping or trying to make my position seem like it is just the only position. So as I said, I am a traditionalist, like in the most, classic way you can put it. But with that being the case, I often tell people, right, that does not mean, therefore, that I am an SSPX partisan, because I really only want to be a partisan of Christ and his church. And so, therefore, I want to look at things a little bit more openly, because as you said, and I think you said this quite wonderfully, you don't want to get into an echo chamber. And the problem is when you get into an echo chamber, you can't hear anything else, right, that's going on. And so one of the things that we need to recognize is, just like in American politics, the reason the Republicans and Democrats aren't getting along is because a lot of them, they're just not talking to each other, right? Not saying that that's the only issue, but we can agree that it's a
tribalism. right? Like you don't
Yeah.
associate with the others, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay out actually my position. I'll say this at the beginning, but then I'm going to clarify it with what the magisterium has said. And I'm actually going to read for you, because there's not a ton. I'm going to read for you all of the magisterial statements on the subject, because there's actually not a lot. Because I feel like at the end of the day, there's a lot of different people online, again, who are partisan, who will want to read one document or another, to give one quote or another. But at the end of the day, I mean, just following classic theology, this is something you'd get in Intro to Theology. The magisterium is our immediate source for interpreting things. And so therefore, that's what I'm going to do. So my official position is this. I think that Rome is correct when it gives the stipulation as thus, that that you as a lay Catholic can attend the SSPX if your desire is to participate in the Mass of the 1962 Missal, right? You can do so without sin. You can receive communion. You can also donate to the collection plate, right, of your local SSPX chapel. However, if your intention is to go to the SSPX because you don't like your local bishop, or because, more importantly, you do not want to be in communion with the Pope, then that would be a sin, right? And so that's what Rome has said. And that's actually the best way to put it. And I say that actually as a traditionalist, because my own personal experience is this, is that I've gone to the SSPX multiple times, and I have no qualm in my conscience about going to the SSPX. That's not my main place that I go to. I go to a diocesan cathedral. But I think that while on the one hand, I don't think that the SSPX is schismatic on paper, I do think that there can be in the laity at times, not always, but at times, somewhat of a schismatic tendency, which I'll get into. But before I get to this, let me go ahead and for you what Rome has said on the subject. So, right, 1988, right, you have the consecrations. Archbishop Lefebvre consecrates 4 bishops, and this was after kind of the fizzling out of discussions with Rome on the subject of ordaining a bishop. Rome had given him the permission to ordain 1 bishop. However, certain things kind of threw in their canonical agreements, and so Archbishop Lefebvre, who I do believe was an extremely holy man and a saintly man, consecrates 4 bishops. Now, when he consecrated the 4 bishops, I believe it was just 2 days after Pope John Paul II, right, he releases his famous document, Ecclesia de Afflicta, right, which was a motu proprio. And for the purposes of our discussion, right, the whole motu proprio has to deal with Archbishop Lefebvre's consecration, but there's a specific line in it that I wish to read, which is mainly the sticking point. And he says that ultimately, at the end of the day, that these actions, right, constitute a schismatic act because it, in practice, is a rejection of Roman primacy, right? So in the 1983 Code of Canon Law, it is required that a bishop who is going to consecrate other bishops has to receive papal mandate. He has to receive a papal okie dokie, if you will, to sign off to go and to consecrate bishops. Now, again, there is actually some loopholes around that in certain circumstances that Archbishop Lefebvre and the SSPX will point out. For instance, one of the loopholes is that you can do so if and only if there is a legitimate necessity to do so. And Archbishop Lefebvre studied the history of the SSPX. He was not a man who was wont to make a rash decision quickly. He was very much so someone who wanted to let things play out. So I don't think that he had in his heart a schismatic intention, because you look at it and he names the Pope in the canon of the Mass, just like the SSPX do today. He also very clearly is not trying to set up his own hierarchy in parallel with it. He very much saying these are Catholic bishops for the Catholic Church, but they don't have any jurisdiction. They are merely here to provide the sacraments to the faithful. That is their only purpose, which him even phrasing it, that's huge.
Yeah. So again, and this is where like I said, I'm not as educated. So wouldn't that be similar to, say, like an FSSP parish? I mean, they don't have, they're also, I mean, what are the differences there? Because no one has any questions about the Fraternity of St. Peter. So would you say that that's like a similar kind of situation, or not, simply because of the genesis, so to speak, of the SSPX,
Yeah,
making it
so
irregular?
yeah, I'd say it's different in this sense. So the FSSP, the St. Peter, has its roots in the SSPX. Directly after the consecrations, you see, I believe it's 8. I could be wrong, but I think it's 8 or 9 priests from the SSPX leave, and they approach John Paul II, but really Cardinal Ratzinger, and they basically ask this, and this is actually maybe will be interesting for the end of this show, but they basically ask, is there a way for a Catholic priest and Catholic faithful in good conscience who want to celebrate the traditional Mass and the sacraments according to the 1962 books, can they do that in good conscience and be, if you will, in full communion with Rome, to use that term? And his answer was yes, like absolutely. The same agreement that Archbishop Lefebvre could have signed, this is Rome's response, is on the table for you. Go for it. And so they sign off on it, and the Fraternity of St. Peter is created. Now, the interesting thing is, to this day, the Fraternity of St. Peter does not have a bishop,
Right.
which the FSSP, I think it would be great if they had their own bishop, or at least one. But this has been somewhat of a response from the SSPX. Now, the main difference between the two, aside from maybe just the canonical standpoint, is that, and this is, I think, where a lot of the root is going to come down to, is that the SSPX accepts Vatican II. Or let me repeat that again. The SSPX does indeed accept Vatican II. However, it asserts that in the documents of Vatican II, particularly in 3 places, there is an impasse. There are phrases and teachings that cannot be joined with the rest of perennial Catholic teaching. These are going to be the issues of religious liberty, right, found in Dignitatis Humanae, the issue of collegiality, which is in Lumen Gentium. I think it's maybe paragraph number 4, if my memory is correct, or maybe it's 11. And then the issue of ecumenism, right? Those 3 are going to be enumerated. And all of this information, if people are wanting to dig into this further, they can go even just to the SSPX website on these said subjects. And then I guess maybe the fourth and final issue is that the SSPX considers the new Mass and the new sacraments valid, completely valid, when they're said with proper form, matter, and minister, right? Obviously, if a priest is getting up and saying the new Mass and he's just making up his own form, and he's using, Cheez-Its for the host, like,
Oh
that's,
man, yeah. Yeah,
you're
obviously that would not be listed or valid. Like,
yeah, it wouldn't be listed or valid. But the SSPX is going to assert that the new Mass, right, would be illicit because it would be against one of the 3 principles enumerated in what makes a law a law. St. Thomas says that there are 3 things that are going to make a law, fundamentally, at the end of the day. One is going to be whether the law is duly promulgated by someone who has due authority, right? So in this case, the Pope, right? 2, that the law has to be for the common good of the subjects. And then 3, that it has to be according to right reason. The SSPX assertion, I think that there is a lot of merit to this. I'm not saying I buy into it 110%, but I think there's a good assertion to it, is that when we look at it, we have to ask ourselves fundamentally this question: is the new Mass Protestantized, or is it not? Right? I think it really comes down to that debate. If it is, then I would say, well, it does not meet the common good aspect of a law, because like the way you pray and worship is going to be the way you believe. So if it is
lex
a
orandi,
Protestant,
lex credendi. Yeah, for sure.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's like, if I'm going to pray like a Protestant, it will affect me over time, and this would be something that would be bad, and therefore it would be valid, but it wouldn't be legally binding upon the faithful to go and put themselves in the danger, spiritual danger. That's going to be the classic SSPX assertion, and this is going to be what is really going to also separate them from the Fraternity of St. Peter. Now, there's a lot of members of the Fraternity of St. Peter, particularly younger priests, who are going to agree actually with the SSPX. But on paper, you're going to see the Fraternity of St. Peter say, we believe in 2 forms of the Roman Rite: extraordinary form and ordinary form, etc. And so, does that make sense? Like, that's going to be the fundamental drift, I think. the
Well,
two.
and it makes, I mean, and that makes sense because that the new mass is the reason why SSPX even exists, right? Like that was the driver. So it makes sense that even today, that's still kind of the focal point for the discussion. Because
Sure,
because
yeah.
it has remained in this sort of murky state where it feels conflicting, right? Like you listen to some people talk about it, and they basically would say, you shouldn't ever go to the SSPX because unless your bishop has made some sort of formal pronouncement or given you permission or whatever. And I'm not even saying that that's wrong necessarily. Obviously, you should be obedient to your bishop. We believe in a hierarchy for you guys. Like you can't ignore
Mm-hmm.
that, and that kind of goes back to the humility component that you were talking about earlier, which I think,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've done it where I feel like I know better than my priest or something. And I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's just a human tendency, especially when we're doing our best. Like I want to say that from the outset. I think all of
Mm-hmm.
us are doing the best that we can with the information that we have, generally speaking. Like I'm assuming good intentions for people in this debate, because it is
Yeah.
a very difficult debate. I have serious qualms with the Novus Ordo, so I understand the resistance of people who have really embraced the SSPX. So I don't want to say that I think this is totally wrong, but there are, it would seem, maybe legitimate criticisms of the SSPX, which is why it remains in this kind of limbo almost
Mhm.
within the church. I mean, do you think that that's accurate?
I think there's a lot of it. It's accurate. Archbishop Lefebvre, the reason that he started the SSPX in the year 1970. Now, by the way, he started it with full canonical um, uh, approval, right? Full canonical approval.
Wow,
He
and
didn't
and
go.
you wouldn't know that. I think most of the time people
Yeah,
don't talk about that.
yeah, you wouldn't. And so from 1970 to 1974, Archbishop Lefebvre had started his. It was a 1-year seminary program in Econ, Switzerland, with the full permission of the local bishop as well as Rome. And really, what got him in trouble was two things. One, the French bishops didn't like this bishop because he was the only bishop that was still forming seminarians according to the Tridentine Rite. And what was interesting about it was the fact that he was actually taking a lot of seminarians from French seminaries. They were kind of leaving their seminaries and going to Econ for training. And so that made the French episcopate not like him, and they gave him the nickname of the Wildcat Seminary, right? They did not like this French bishop doing
Hmm.
this. But then the second thing, which I think this is really what got him in a lot of trouble, and I actually applaud him over this in principle, is that he had two emissaries from Rome come and do a canonical visit, right? And so Rome, from in different periods, will send advisors and emissaries, if you will, to go and to investigate seminaries as well as formation houses to basically see everything is okay. And so they went. Archbishop Lefebvre opened the doors to them, welcomed them in, and they spent a couple days there. And they didn't attend any masses while they were there, but they basically gave the Pope, Paul VI, they said everything was great except for the Mass. The Mass is still the Tridentine Rite. But while they were there, they scandalized many of the seminarians because, especially during the 70s, to put it mildly, was insane, right? Absolutely insane.
Much like the
And
time wherein we're where we are now. I mean, let's be
yeah,
honest. It's insane right now.
yeah, absolutely insane. And these two emissaries, they scandalized the seminarians because they were talking about things like, well, did Christ really physically raise from the dead, or did he raise again in our hearts? Or things like, well, we know eventually that the clergy will be married, things along that nature, kind of these kind of modern tropes. Now, when it comes to obviously the first one, right, that is a modernist interpretation of the resurrection. Obviously,
Right.
priestly celibacy is a discipline, right? It's not a dogma of faith. So I
Right.
want to make that distinction. But right, still very clearly scandalous with this first one. And so Archbishop Lefebvre comes out with what's called his 1974 declaration, where the summary of it is pretty short. It's like one-page document, but he basically says, I am holding fast to eternal Catholic Rome, and I am going to reject the neo-modernistic and neo-Protestant tendency of modernist Rome, which is enumerated in Vatican Council II and the Novus Ordo Missae and the subsequent reforms. Now, it's harsh language, but sometimes you also have to put yourself back in the time and place and say, okay, well, it's always easy for us to live in the philosophical state of presentism, right? Be in the present and judge people in the past. Well,
Yeah.
we have to put ourselves back there and like, well, I mean, if all of the the church is really collapsing in a lot of ways, then that's something that's going to be at least scandalous, and I at least understand why he would do these things. So to speak forward, because this is where we kind of get into what Roma said, speak forward, he consecrates the bishops. He does this because not because he's just wanting to necessarily be disobedient. He does this mainly because of the 1986 meeting in Assisi, right? Which maybe, I don't know if you can relate because you're a cradle Catholic. I'm not. I'm a convert, but it's like you have to understand, I come from like the world of Southern evangelicalism. So like when I came into the church, it was during the time of the Pachamama incidents. And I already had questions about sacred images and just in a general sense.
But it's not a good look for Catholics.
It was so bad. It was so
such
bad.
a scandal. Yeah.
But I feel like maybe, I don't know, maybe some cradle Catholics have kind of gotten used to the whole interfaith prayer stuff. But like, if you think about it, if you're Archbishop Lefebvre, or you're just an older priest or even an older lay person, and you grow up under the times of like Pius X, Benedict XV, Pius XI, Pius XII, and then all of a sudden the Pope is praying with all these religions, you're just kind of like, what is going? I mean, even myself, right, who reads through old dogmatic theology textbooks, I do not understand how you can try to square Assisi with just the fundamental basis of just the treatise on divine revelation. It's like God has given to mankind a positive, divinely revealed religion for the salvation of our souls. That's a dogma of faith. And therefore, let's pray with everyone. Like, it's just so
that's such a good point. I don't want to derail you too much, but I see this all the time, even I feel like I see this a lot within the pro-life movement too. You sort of get like people just, and this is what I mean, is that you become inoculated to the cultural environment that you're in, and you're like that boiling frog. And so you have to sort of reclaim that understanding and sense of urgency so that you can actually tackle the issue for what it is, right? So you're right. That's actually a huge problem I have with ecumenism as it is today, because we're not, I think I said this before we started recording, but we're not calling people to more, and we're not calling people home. There's a huge problem when we're giving the impression or scandalizing people into sort of this pluralism, like this is all okay. Everyone takes a different path to heaven, but we can all get there, that we all would be saved and all this stuff. This is very problematic. And I think, of course, it's a huge driver for the wedge that we're seeing today between different more traditionally minded Catholics and even more of the like Vatican II Catholics. There's a huge wedge because we see this fundamental difference insofar as the Catholic Church is the true church. And like, there's a group of us that don't want it watered down, and we don't want to lose our birthright, as Dr. Peter Kwasniewski kind of talks about it.
Yeah, that, or just the fact that it's like in our design, it's like this. One of the things I feel very much so called to write on, and I just need to sit down and actually formulate my thoughts to write on, is this idea that the church, according to her teaching and according to the teaching of Scripture, her mission is the salvation of souls, period. It is the mission of continuing our Lord's work. Whenever we think of that phrase, the Great Commission, right? Go into all the world and preach the gospel. Commission means like I'm working with, right? And so we're working with to save the world. So that's our mission. But if the mission of the church has now shifted into, well, unite all men under some fraternal banner where we're all friends and brothers and things like that, we've missed the mission. We've missed the point. And so when Archbishop Lefebvre consecrates these bishops, it's kind of in that spirit. Now, people debate whether it's that was right or wrong, right? There's a whole lot of debate on that subject, right? And I'm not going to give you guys this is what I think or not think, because to be honest, when I look at this situation, I lean more toward being sympathetic with the SSPX.
So do I. Yeah.
But I'm not 100% there, because again, when it comes to these issues, I'm not a total 100% partisan. But what happens is that Rome, essentially says, right, it says Archbishop Lefebvre, according to canon law, has excommunicated himself. So it's called, I believe it's called latent sententia excommunication, whereby when you do this action, you excommunicate yourself. Now, the excommunication was for himself. There was also another bishop that was there that a lot of people don't know. There was another bishop that was co-consecrating with him, Bishop de Castro Meyer, who was a Brazilian, I believe it was. And so they were both excommunicated, as well as the 4 bishops that were consecrated. Now, when that happened, that does not mean that the laity or the priests of the SSPX, etc., were excommunicated. It would have just been the people inside the group. But from 1988 till the year 2000, there was a whole lot of just basically, it was like, boyfriend and girlfriend have a big fight and no one wants to talk about it. Like they just go off into
Elephant in the room.
different.
Yeah, I was just gonna silent treatment. Yeah, cold shoulder.
From what I've read, now again, I was born in 1998, so I don't obviously remember that time period, but from what I've learned, it was pretty bad. It was just anger. And so, but what happened from there? There was a couple documents that did take place during this time. So in 1999, in 1998 or 88, you have the creation of the Pontifical Congregation Ecclesia Dei, which is essentially a Roman congregation which is going to try to bring in members of Archbishop Lefebvre's movement inside of, as they see it, inside of the church or into fuller communion, and they can have the traditional mass, etc. They're encouraged to have John Paul II encourages the bishops to be liberal with the traditional mass. Give it to them, please give it to them, right? And what happens though is that during this time, this commission, Ecclesia Dei, gets several questions, right? So in 1999, they comment on the situation, the SSPX, and this is really one of the first comments that we get on the situation. And they say because of their attraction, they talk about specifically the people, because of their attraction to the traditional Latin Mass, right, they would not be in schism, right? But if they refuse submission to the Roman Pontiff or reject communion with the members of the church subject to him, right, that would be considered, those people who go to the chapels would be schismatic. Now, when I read that just as someone who wants to be a theologian, I can say, just from the theological perspective, right, without kind of playing favorites to either side, I would say technically, yeah, that's 100% correct in the statement. And in 1999, there was a sharper, or 95, there was a sharper condemnation where they said it was morally illicit for the faithful to participate in the masses of the SSPX unless there was they were physically or morally impeded from going to other masses. Now, this is the weird thing.
So morally impeded, what does that mean? Because, for example, like me, so that just feels very subjective. And somebody commented earlier, and this is one thing that I've been thinking about this too, is the interior disposition here. Really sort of is the distinction for whether or not it would be sinful or to go to the SSPX or not, whether that would, remove you from a state of grace. So, I think whoever was commenting, I wish I could find it here. And maybe I will here in just a moment, but, he sort of was arguing that that's sort of a Protestant understanding of the human person. And I actually would challenge that a little bit because we don't exist in this dualism. You cannot separate the interior life from the exterior life as much as we try. And so to have a properly ordered interior disposition is essential for sanctity. That's really the root in my mind for knowing, loving, and serving our Lord in this life. And the next is sort of overcoming that brokenness. That's part of what sin does, is it separates our natures where our spirit is willing, but our flesh is weak. And what we're trying to do is bridge that gap. That's if you listen to my show, that's what I say at the opening every single time on my own channel. So that's why this is really important to me. But our interior disposition has to be acknowledged. And so I could see why that would feel kind of fluffy and like more of that emotive understanding of the human person, I guess. And we sort of live in this world where it is very feelings based. But in terms of a theological understanding of our own humanity and our dignity, it would make sense that this part of, our rationality and why we choose to go to the SSPX is actually really important. What do you think about that?
No, I agree, because it's, there's a commentary in here that I thought brought up an interesting point. He says that the SSPX does not reject the magisterium. Get real. I like the Gen Z terminology in there. I would agree in a sense, because it's like when you look, for instance, at this saying, right? Ecclesia Dei saying that it would be morally illicit for the faithful to participate in the SSPX Mass unless they're physically or morally impeded, right, from participating in a Mass of a priest in good standing. It's kind of like, okay, well, first off, like, what is the binding effect of that? When you do, if people study dogmatic theology, right, the theological note for that, our boy Tim Flanders, right, brings up pretty good. He talks very much more about like what is even the decrees of Roman congregations, right? At the end of the day, that's what's going to be just called, the theological note for that's just going to be called safe, right? It's just going to be safe, and essentially that if you were to disobey, right, the effect of this would be the mortal sin of disobedience, or perhaps maybe just imprudence. So the declaration of Ecclesia Dei is not infallible in and of itself. It is just morally safe, right? And that's why they use that term morally, right, et cetera, et cetera. But here's the thing. This is what gets weird. When we go further down in the historical track, right, closer to today, the discussion seems to swap completely from in the 1990s. So in 2000, this is where things really start to change. In 2000, there's actually some videos of this on YouTube if people are interested, but the 4 SSPX bishops lead all the priests into St. Peter's Basilica themselves, right, with the massive cross, and they're singing all these Latin chants, and it's a sign of their loyalty to Rome, right? So one of the things that we can say is like, okay, the SSPX, okay, does pray for the Pope in the canon of the Mass. It does not pray for their own bishops in the canon of the Mass. It prays for the local bishop in the canon of the Mass. So those are things that very much so separate them from the Sede crowd. Sometimes I see people online say that the SSPX, the pre-Sedes, like that's just misinformation. And even if you disagree with them, like that is a little bit imprecise, to put it in a charitable way, right? Just a little imprecise. Yeah, to put it nicely.
You're wrong. You're wrong, and you're fired.
Yeah, exactly. You're just you're not being right. But what ends up
you're not being right. That's so funny.
You're not.
I'm gonna say that the next time I'm upset with somebody. You're not being right.
Well, I feel like that might be your motherly spirit talking to your children. You're not being right.
Yeah, maybe. Okay, so sorry. Go ahead. That was just a funny wording. I loved it.
What happens is, so Pope John Paul II, right? He passes away. Thank you, Roman Baron. Yes, absolutely. He's memeing me right now. But what happens is, that John Paul II, right, rest in peace, he passes away. Cardinal Ratzinger becomes Pope Benedict XVI, and what ends up happening is discussions start taking place between the SSPX and Rome about a potentially full canonical recognition. Now, the SSPX give several stipulations about what they want to happen. So, for instance, in 2005, there's a famous discussion between the SSPX and Cardinal Castrillno, who he is president, or the man in charge, if you will, of Ecclesia Dei. And he says to the crowd, or he says in the context of his public office, that the situation with the SSPX merely represents a situation of separation, even if it is not formal schism, right? And so he says it cannot be said incorrect, in fact, and precise terms that there is a schism. So he's saying it cannot be in the precise term that there is a schism. They are within the church.
Too long, don't raid, don't call SSPX schismatics. Is that what I just heard?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Stop saying that.
Yeah, it's more or less, he's just saying it's not a formal schism. So what he means by that is it's like, again, that term formal is going to be asserting that there was a very much so
like an intentional removal of self, kind of like a heretic, right? Like you have a formal heretic, and then I can't remember what the other form is. Material
heretic and a heretic. Yeah, exactly. And so there was no formal declaration by Archbishop Lefebvre saying, you're not the Pope, we're out of here, we're starting over at square one, et cetera, right? And so maybe one could argue that there was material, which I'll get into in a second. We cannot say that there was at least formal, because Rome has never said. That wasn't the
intention.
Yeah, exactly. And the congregations of Rome, which do have a certain authority, right, a theologically safe authority, are going to say, well, no, like that it's not at least formal. So what ends up taking place is they end up having discussions, right? And so the discussions, particularly, it comes down to three things. The SSPX asked from Rome under Pope Benedict XVI for three things. The first is that in order for them to maybe accept a personal prelature, right, inside of the church, which is kind of like a Society of Apostolic Life, to give an example, they would have to, one, grant all priests of the Latin Rite the liberal permission to celebrate the Tridentine Mass. Two, that the excommunications would be lifted. Now, in the SSPX mind, they're not going to consider the excommunications to be valid or licit, and there's a certain appeal and argument that you can get from that. And the third thing, and this is the real sticking point, was that Catholics in good conscience can, in these three areas of Vatican II, right, dissent from these teachings and still remain fully Catholic. Now, what ends up happening is over the series of a couple of years, right, we have Summorum Pontificum, right, comes out, and it grants liberty to everyone, right, to all of the priests of the Latin Rite, the liberal permission to celebrate the Tridentine Mass. And notice what's interesting about even the document. It was Benedict's argument, Pope Benedict XVI's argument was that these priests, right, that the traditional Mass was not abrogated, right? And this was something that even Pope John Paul II, he commissioned himself in the 90s during his discussions with Archbishop Lefebvre. He had a commission that that went and tried to cover this question of, has the Tridentine Missal been abolished? And the conclusion of the theological committee was no, it was not abolished. There was never any formal declaration saying, I abrogate thus. So that takes place. You also see, I think it's 2009. Someone will probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's 2009. The excommunications are lifted. Now, immediately after that, you have some major drama hit the fan. You have one of the bishops, Bishop Williamson. He comes out on, it's either in some writing or maybe it was a television interview. I don't know. Someone let me know in the comments. But there was somehow it was leaked to the press. He had some spicy takes on the subject of the Holocaust, which I do not agree with Bishop Williamson's assessment at all. However, what takes place is Rome obviously is, or at least the news media is throwing everything they can, ballistic missiles at Rome. And so there's some tough situations that take place there. But that last issue goes into the theological discussions. Rome and the SSPX go into theological discussions. And unfortunately, right, from everything that I could see, the theological discussions didn't really have very much merit. And these discussions lasted from, I believe, 2009 up till 2012 or 14, somewhere there. I think it was 14, actually. And during this time, basically, there's an impasse. The SSPX say, and I think, understandably, that we can't understand how we can go from the, for instance, like with religious liberty, how we go from a place where you have popes like Pope Gregory the 16th or Pius IX saying that religious liberty is insanity and demonstrable to society, to now saying that it's a civil right that should be practiced,
tolerated and encouraged. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's weird because it's like, paragraph 1 of Unitatis Humanae, which is actually was inserted by Archbishop Lefebvre himself, says we maintain the traditional Catholic doctrine on nation states. But then in paragraph 2, it says, people are free from coercion, which is totally in line with Catholic doctrine. But then it says the government does not have the ability to curb false religion. And
yeah, but like, what about the Roman Empire? I mean, like,
yeah,
you know what I mean? Or like even Christendom. That was like the beauty of it.
Yeah. Well, to even steelman the case.
Yeah. Go ahead.
To steelman the case against the SSPX, it's like so it's like this. On the one hand, our faith comes from the sources of revelation, scripture and tradition, but it's interpreted through the magisterium, the teaching office of the church. So the magisterium is our immediate rule of faith. Now, it's like this. If let's just say there were nation states in the medieval era that were, stamping out false religions. The magisterium never said anything, and the magisterium then came out with Dignitatis Humanae. Okay, right? They can do that. Like, if a Christian prince was to go and do something, just because a Christian prince did it, doesn't mean it's part of the deposit of faith. Doesn't mean that it's part.
It doesn't like baptize it right away. You know what I
mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, because we could find all kinds of weird examples of Christian kings doing
Well,
That
Christian
was
kings
really
and
bad.
even popes, I mean, let's talk.
Mhm.
I mean, there's that too. I mean, sometimes, and that's
Yeah, it's kind of
the
like, are we
frustration of,
going are we going to accept, I think it's Alexander the seventh, like digging up his like the former pope, putting him on
yes,
trial and then
ugh.
chucking him into the river? Like, no, like
Right.
we're not
But
going to do
that's the
that.
thing too. So then how do you balance this with this hyperpapalism that we see? Because
Hmm.
that's a real problem too. I mean, I think that's part of the divide right now is like anytime, and maybe it's just because I feel we're a little soft. Like criticism
Hmm.
is not allowed ever, or constructive feedback. It's always an attack. And so anytime you criticize some of the things that the Pope is saying, you even alluded to it earlier. I mean, look, there's just no denying, and I guess I'm not trying to get off the rails too much, but I mean, I've been doing pro-life work for over a decade. And to
Hmm.
see many of the appointments within the Pontifical Academy for Life, to see some of the people that Pope Francis has celebrated in the Vatican or elevated, all of these
Hmm.
things, and then they don't really mesh with the things that he's saying about abortion. I mean, he
Hmm.
speaks very strongly against abortion, even though maybe he says some other questionable things. I don't know. It's like, but if you point that out, sometimes people get upset with you for pointing
Yeah.
out that, or like, we're not even allowed to acknowledge that these appointments are egregious. And if you say that, then you're schismatic because the Pope did it and whatever he says goes, and you're just a bad
Yeah.
person for pointing that out. But at the same time, it's like there's a middle way. Like there's a lot of our faith is both and, right? It's not either or,
Mhm.
but we need to call everybody to Christ. And that means a higher standard, and that doesn't mean overlooking things needlessly because it doesn't fit into our worldview.
Yeah, no, 100%. There's definitely, it's like on the one hand, while there's definitely the trad red pilling movement, there's
Yeah.
a
Hmm.
opposite blue pilling movement where it's just kind of like everything's fine, y'all, don't worry.
Yeah, the
Like,
little dog in the house that's on fire, like everything's
yeah,
fine. Yeah,
yeah, it's
yeah.
like everything's fine. And so this is where it gets weird because it's like when you read traditional theology, you see that the state's role is to uphold the religion of Christ, to promote the religion of Christ, and to at the same time also help guide man to that common good, right? Which is ultimate, like, union with God. And so you see this in the tradition, you see this in the magisterium, and then you do see what seems to be a reversal of some form. And when you read the different interpretations of how you can try to square dignitatis humanae, there's like 50 interpretations of it, of how you could try to square it. And some of them go as far as saying, like in the Communio school will say it is a reversal of Catholic social teaching. Others will say it's not. You have to look at other details. I think the point is though that even historically it became really bad because Rome ended up with meetings with Italy as well as with Spain, encouraging them to drop Catholicism as the official religion of state in different nations. So you see this,
Mhm.
and so it's like I understand the SSPX warranted now, and here's where we're at today, and this is really one of the last things, is that so after 2009, right? You see the discussion, Benedict XVI, he comes out with this famous saying that's often pointed at them, which says that, until these doctrinal questions are clarified, the society has no canonical status in the church, right? And therefore they still do receive that ecclesiastical penalty. But then you see Pope Francis as an example. He grants them the faculties to perform confessions validly because maybe catechism refresher for everyone, but when it comes to the sacraments of confession and holy matrimony, these are going to be sacraments in which the church has to give jurisdiction, right, to the bishops and to the pope, to the bishops and to the priests to perform marriages validly, not just licitly, but validly,
Mhm.
unless there's an extreme circumstance, et cetera, which is what the SSPX is going to assert. So Pope Francis gives them the green light. And essentially, the last real congregation the statement that we do have is where I began with, which is that the official position of the now former Ecclesia Dei, right, congregation, now it's been moved into the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith. Now the question comes down to this, which is just you're allowed to attend if your desire is to participate in the Missal of 1962, but if it is an intention to separate oneself from the unity of the church, then that would be wrong. Now, I'll say this, and I want to get your kind of opinion on your maybe stuff you've experienced in your own life, but I think that that's actually really well phrased, because it's this way, at least in my perspective of how, and I could be wrong, right? But when I look at around online, and I also look in person with my own dealings with the issue of the SSPX, on the one hand, it's like, okay, when I go literally to participate in the Mass of 1562, right? I do have serious qualms about the new Mass myself. I have a whole series on my show called The Problem with the Novus Ordo Missae, right? It's very long, but we very much
Go
try
look
to...
at his YouTube channel, you guys.
Yeah, please go check me out. But there's some real, and I try to steelman the argument, right? I try to go into, well, what about disciplinary infallibility? Like, is that a thing? I try to steelman the argument for the new missal. I don't just be like, well, a clown mass versus a solemn high. Like, that's bad scholarship, and trads need to get better at that. But what ends up happening is, so I'll go, and I think that's fine. And I think that a lot of the priests that I've talked to that have been involved with SSPX have been fantastic. When I talk to them about doctrinal matters, they're solid. It's like they're not just solid, like they're actually well learned. They actually understand the intricacies of faith. I'll sometimes bring up to priests who I greatly love, who are inside of the new mass world, and I'll ask them questions about theology, maybe on ecclesiology or some subject or another. And I'll find what ends up happening is that they don't end up knowing a lot of the questions about these. Now, maybe it's just the people I'm talking to. But when it comes to the laity involved with the SSPX, I think it's a mixed bag. I've met a lot of SSPX people who I think are fantastic, very holy people who really just do want to go and save their soul and try to preserve faith the best that they can. I also have found some internet manifestations, let's put it that way, of stereotypes at SSPX chapels where maybe they harp on about issues that don't need to be harped on about, and they make it just these massive things. So, for instance, sometimes people that I've encountered who go to the SSPX really do despise not just the Pope, but also the local bishop. And I do think that crosses a line. And I think that the line is it's on the one hand, it's okay to have qualms about what the Pope does. When we read through the tradition of the theologians, we see the great theologians from Aquinas to Scotus to Suarez and Bonaventure and Cajetan and John of St. Thomas and Bellarmine, and they're going on and on and on about all of these different what ifs about a pope, and about, like, there are very much so times and where it's licit and needed for priests and laity to call the pope to task if stuff is going on. But where I think a lot of trads go too far is that they've now, and this is, I think, maybe it can become a problem in the SSPX, is that if there is a certain situation where you are kind of on a practical level separated from your local bishop, while sometimes maybe it could be argued that it's necessary, right? Like, for instance, in the Supage's diocese or something like that, maybe while you could argue that, in other situations, maybe not so much. And what happens is there's a psychological problem, which I think does develop over time, where it's that if you're separated from the kind of just the normative ecclesial structure of your diocese, that you can kind of fall into this mentality of an us versus them. It's, we're wanting to be away from these people, because you guys have to recognize schism is both vertical and horizontal, right? Schism can be that way. And so when we think of schism, we think of it as directly refusing to recognize the Pope as the Pope, or refusing to submit to him and the bishops. But then there's also going to be the schism that is horizontal, which is, I don't want fellowship with my fellow Catholic. I'm going to consider the Catholics who go to the Novus Ordo not Catholic. And that, I think, is not correct, right? I think that is a step too far, and it comes from a place, I think, of wounding and of just man's natural sinful anthropology, unfortunately. And so that's why I think that at the end of the day, and maybe this is what you and I can talk about now, is, so there's this situation with the SSPX. It's been proclaimed by Rome, you can go under these circumstances, you should not under these circumstances. But why are we still talking about it? Like, why are we still Why are we
Thank
still
you.
warring over it? It's kind of like, okay, well, the SSPX is here, but look at a lot of the things that they're complaining about. The German bishops are a big problem. We have to understand trads don't have any type of massive influence off of the internet. Like, we have to understand that.
I
Like,
know. Well,
like
so like what you're getting at though, I think is kind of the crux of the issue. We can talk about the SSPX all day, but really they're not the problem. I mean, insofar as yeah, we can acknowledge that maybe they're in an irregular situation, right? But the
mhm,
things that the SSPX, those who go to the SSPX are concerned about, let's talk about that. Let's talk about why they are not going to their diocesan parish or, you know, any
mhm,
of these other institutions within, you know, within their diocese. Let's talk about that. Why are they disengaged and why did it come into fruition to begin with? Like, let's talk about that and have a charitable discussion about it, wherein we're not straw manning each other, but we are steel manning each other. I think that's the only way to have a productive conversation.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's like if we're going, we have to recognize that the trads in general, right? So number one, I saw a Dominican priest one time. He said this, and I thought it was very true. He says, "Why are we trying to, limit the people who want to go to mass?" As opposed to the people who don't even care, right, about the
Right.
mass in a general sense. Like the SSPX clearly care about the mass. Traditionalists as a broader whole clearly love mass. They clearly want to be in church every day. They clearly want to be
Mm.
practicing faith very fervently. So on like one end of the spectrum, like why are we focusing on that? Even if you think traditionalism is a problem, which let's just say I'll grant that as a for sake of argument. Even if you think it's a problem, it's like an ant, right? It's like an ant biting at your heel when a bear is in the room. And the bear is called the synodal way. The bear is called,
Yes.
right,
Oh my goodness. Yeah, the
perfect.
synod stuff right now is
Yeah.
so atrocious. It's like,
Like
yeah,
like
let's
there's a
talk
bunch
about
of
this stuff. Let's talk. Why are we missing the forest for the trees? Right?
mhm,
Why are there's this huge forest in front of you and you're like worried about this pine tree right here that's about to fall down. You're like, but look at the whole forest. There's like all this other stuff going on right now in the church, and we need to come together, like have more of
mhm,
a unifying presence and say, yeah, we have our differences, but we have a church to save. You know, like God,
mhm,
we have to do our part, is what I'm saying. Obviously, it's Christ's church, and he will allow his bride to suffer in this way. He himself suffered, and we're here for the ride. But that doesn't mean we don't have to use our hands and feet. Like, let's
mhm,
come together in communion and say, like, okay, how do we address some of these real problems? Like, this stuff going on with the synod on synodality is horrific. Even the artwork.
mhm,
I mean, for all the way down to the artwork, it's just ugly. So why aren't we
mhm.
talking more about this stuff? Why are we spending our time creating content where we're just attacking each other and calling each other idiots? Because I don't
Yeah,
think most
no.
of these people are idiots.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. It's something where it's like trads have very little influence. There's not one bishop, there's not one diocesan structure where the trads have a majority, right? There's a few bishops around the world who will give wind, if you will, to the issues that traditionalists bring up, but they don't have a lot of power. Now, one commenter, I think he made a somewhat of a fair point, which was that the SSPX can be causing people to view the church as a problem and as bad actors. There is a certain truth, I would say, maybe to certain members, right? And I say lay
Yeah.
members.
Yeah.
I think that when you, not wholly, but at least in my personal experience, when I talk to a lot of the priests very much so love the church, love the Pope. Maybe not the things that he does, but there is definitely going to be let's just put it that way. I don't think that charge is unique to the SSPX. I think that you can find plenty of people in Communio schools and John Paul II centers who are going to say that there's major issues in the hierarchy. Um,
Well, that's
and we could.
you can't ignore that. That's just a human thing. I mean, that's
Mm-hmm,
politics. You get
mm-hmm,
people in a governing body and we're broken and fallen, and yeah, there's going to be some bad actors. I'm not
mm-hmm,
going to say all of them are bad actors, but I think there maybe I mean that's just what happens. Humans can be corrupted, and the more power you have, the more of a temptation that is. That's just, you can't ignore that. But how do we, and I agree, like I have a priest, he celebrates the Novus Ordo. He also does the Latin Rite. He does the extraordinary form on, sorry, it's all the Latin Rite. So forgive me. Don't anybody clip that and be like, Angela doesn't know what she's talking about at all. I kind of know what I'm talking about. But he celebrates the extraordinary form on Saturday mornings, and for baptisms and other rites, like he definitely does that. But he does celebrate the Novus Ordo on Sunday, even though it's one of those unicorn Novus Ordos. I know people hate that, but it really is. I mean, it's ad orientem, and we have a lot of Latin and chanting, and it's as close to the extraordinary form that you could get, I would say. And he's really been inoculating our parish into the extraordinary form, because he would love to celebrate only in the extraordinary form if it were up to him. But this is just where we're at. But I will say too, in terms of his disposition to the church, he's still a very obedient son. Like, so he's not going, and I think a lot of traditionalists are. I think most of them are. We have this desire to be obedient. I don't think there's this rebellious nature, because we understand the value of obedience. But it has to be, like anything else, properly discerned and properly ordered, right? Like that's just the conscience. We have a duty to develop a properly formed conscience, and that's where I think the discussion that Jeremiah and Tim had the other day on their show, it was really, really well done. If you guys haven't watched it, go listen to it. But they talk about the importance of having a properly formed conscience, and the rights of being able to exercise your conscience freely, and what does that mean according to the church. So I think that's also very pertinent to this discussion, especially when we're talking about whether or not it is okay to go to SSPX parishes.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's here's an interesting thought, which is just that, and this is something I've been molding over, is that, so for instance, I see a few people in the chat who I actually know pretty well. They're going to be people in my life who know that, for instance, when it comes to just me as a person, right? I love, as I've said many times in the show already, I love reading the preconciliar theological manuals, right? That's stuff that I am very much so into understanding and learning. And when you read through preconciliar theology, it's highly ultramontane in spirit, like a good ultramontane, like looking over the hills to Sea of Peter for the answers to our questions, and the Sea of Peter is warring against the enemies of the faith, right? It's just super based and amazing. But when we also take a step back and we look at the situation, we sometimes have to recognize that our theology has to sometimes not be changed, but maybe adapted in personal practice when it comes to the situations that we can be in. But here's the deal. Where I think that the SSPX has a lot of points that can be given to them. But I will say that that if it was not for the crisis in the church, I do not think that the SSPX should be doing what they're doing. And I think they would agree with me, is that when you go and you actually read the SSPX material, the SSPX material is going to be very much so based off of, and I think that for everyone in the chat, maybe this could be a question for you guys to think about as well, is there a crisis in the church, like a fun, not just an abstract crisis, but like a legit crisis in the church, where it is causing the damnation and confusion of millions of souls, to the point where priests sometimes in a society have to take drastic action to try to save souls, right? And that's going to be the argument of SSPX, is it's going to say there's going to be a necessity that has to be here. If there wasn't, I would say the SSPX has no business of doing anything that they're doing, because
right. If we didn't have a Father James Martin situation where he's being elevated in terms of ecclesial authority and working within the Vatican, you know what I mean? Like, you get these types and you're like, how is this possible? Like, no wonder people are confused.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's what I think it comes down to, is just that issue of, is there a necessity? Is there a legit crisis? And is the crisis so bad where it requires, the priests to kind of go outside of this, And the thing is, I think that the crisis, maybe on the one hand, people can argue the church has always been, in a certain sense, a crisis because we're always being under attack. But also, to be fair, it's kind of like, well, if as students of history, it's kind of like if we put ourselves in the time of like, I don't know, like the postmodernist crisis where there is just, heretic hunting everywhere and theology is just flourishing. And it's not that everything's great, right? Tim has well documented that not everything was great in that preconciliar time period, but it was definitely better. It's kind of like, well, when we compare it to the situation and we're now today, I don't know how we've got from the time of Pius X condemning modernism to the time where, God wills all religions and, that's his permissive will when I'm called to the carpet, but I don't know. Like it's concerning. It's very concerning.
Right.
Like I, as a former evangelical, would never, ever, 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 ever get to that place of saying that God wills all religions, right? Now, I understand we can argue was that comment meaning passive or not.
Right.
Now, on the flip side, because of my evangelical background, I don't want to fall into a Protestant spirit and not submit. But it's also kind of like, well, if what we're kind of being told to submit to are things where, at least on the surface level of it, is very concerning, right? And when we do approach with dubia and then dubia is never answered, right? These situations become pretty tough. So
yeah, and that's where I think it's so important that we are charitable towards one another. It's a very confusing time, and I'll be the first to admit, I mean, there have been times when I have looked for an out I've tried to leave the church, like trying to find something. I mean, I for a while was considering Judaism because I was like, man, if Catholicism's not right, then I don't know, like Protestantism, like I just was very convicted that was not correct, and I knew Islam was not correct. So it's like, I guess that sort of just leaves me with Judaism. I don't really know what else it could be.
You and I have reached the same conclusion, which is it's kind of like this. It's like if Catholicism wasn't true, which I don't believe, because I have absolute certainty that the faith is true because of not just what I've studied, but because there's such credibility in her teachings and in her way of life. But in the world of abstract hypotheticals, yeah, I mean, Judaism would be the only thing, because at least it would be the old
only
covenant.
answer would be that yes, that the covenant had not been fulfilled and that Christ was not the Messiah. And so then that becomes the question, because if Christ is the Messiah, then the Catholic Church is the only true church. And because Christ was the Messiah, he is the Messiah, the Catholic Church is the true church. Like, it really is that basic. It's that basic for syllogism. There it is. If you're wondering the life's biggest questions, you guys, the Catholic Church is the true church because Christ is the Messiah and he established the Catholic Church. That's it. That's as basic as it gets. But yeah, I mean, I would be lying if I said, like, I haven't tried to find a way out, especially during the Summer of Shame. I was working for LifeSite News during the Summer of Shame. Could you imagine working for LifeSite News during the Summer of Shame? That's like all we're reporting on.
I remember I was Protestant whenever the Summer of Shame went on, and that was way before I was considering being Catholic. But we, in the Protestant world, for those of us who were at least had our ear to the ground listening, we were just like, yep, this only continues what we already knew, which is just that, the church is full of perverts, if you will. Which is, it's unfair because, to be fair,
they have the same problem in Protestantism too. They just don't admit it. It's even worse because their claim is always that, well, it's because priests are celibate. It's because Catholic priests are celibate. And then they do the exact same thing. And it's like, oh, all of a sudden we're not talking about celibacy anymore. All of a sudden you're like looking at the issue for what it is, which is man is like selfish and disgusting sometimes, like we're disordered if we're not really seeking holiness anyway.
Yeah, so, no, 100%.
Well, I think that's a really good place to end here. Thanks so much for you guys joining us tonight. I just am blown away. So many of you have stuck with us for the last over an hour, almost an hour and a half. So let's end here with you telling us a little bit more about what you have coming up on your channel, Nick. And then maybe I'll give a couple of updates. If you could please stay, I do have a couple of prayer requests for you guys. So you go first, though.
Sure, yeah, I'll make it brief. So I have a show, right? As you guys can see, the Traditional Thomist. Go over there and give me a sub. We're almost at 2,000 strong. And for those of you viewers who are from me, you guys need to actually come over and subscribe to Angela's actual show. So this is Meaning of Catholic, but go subscribe to her actual show, Integrated. Because it's a pretty cool show. I tuned in with one of your knitting sessions and I was like, I don't know why this is like, actually
This is
enjoyable
fun?
to watch as a 24-year-old male. So
That's so funny.
Um,
Thank you.
but it was just like, I guess it was just really wholesome. But I'll be making a series for everyone who is interested. I'm doing a series over the new missal, but I'm also going to be coming out with a series over traditional Catholic dogmatic theology. So if you're interested in what does the church teach according to the sources underneath the magisterium's umbrella with the proper theological notes, go over to the Traditional Thomist and do a sub. We're going to be going through the Sacrae Theologiae Summa, which is a 8 long text volume book on the subject of dogmatic theology. And so if you're interested in learning more about traditional Catholic dogmatic theology, go over there. We'll also be doing some Catholic moral theology from Father Prumer's work. Those are in the works, right? They're in the works right now. But yeah, stay tuned for that. And so that's the big thing. Also, you guys can follow me over. I don't do a ton of social media.
Yeah, I was
But I
trying to
do.
find you on most of your social, and it was hard, actually.
Yeah,
By the way.
the only one that I'm on show-wise is Instagram. So if you guys want to, if you guys have Instagram, go over to the Traditional Thomist. And I post mainly just story things throughout the day. But yeah, I knew that to save my soul, I must avoid Catholic Twitter, and so I have never been on Catholic Twitter, and I'm happy
Good for
because
you. Good for
they'll
you.
probably give me some merit by God's grace in the end. So, but yeah.
Well, I'm surely damned because I am on Catholic Twitter. So if you want, you can find me on social media as well. So here are my couple of prayer requests for you guys. So first of all, for those of you who do follow me on Catholic Twitter, I'm on Twitter, Instagram. I have a Facebook page too. I can't handle any more than that right now. But if you're on my Twitter, you've probably seen that one of the other moms at our homeschooling co-op just passed away. She was the young mom of 5 kids. Her oldest is 14 and her youngest 11 months old. And her funeral is this upcoming Tuesday. So if you guys could please pray for her and her family as they lay her to rest, I would really, really appreciate that. It's a huge loss in the community. She was brilliant. Her name is Heidi, and you can find some of my tweets. I'll retweet something about it tonight so you guys can look at our Caring Bridge and learn more about her. But I would really appreciate that, and I know her family would too. Second, I mentioned in the show that I've been a pro-life activist for over a decade now, and there's some really awful legislation going through the Minnesota State Legislature right now that would codify abortion on demand through all 9 months of pregnancy, and another bill that would and the Born Alive Infant Protection Act here in Minnesota as well. And like horrible comprehensive sex ed and all just all the worst legislation you can imagine is going through the Minnesota House right now and the Senate. So please pray for our state. Please pray for an end to abortion. That's my thing. I really appreciate that. Lastly, feel free to come follow me on my channel. I really appreciate that. I only have I don't know, not even 300 subs. So definitely nowhere near your 2,000. But any of you guys that are interested in learning more about integration and kind of how we can really live out our Catholic faith and bring our inner dispositions into alignment with how we live, that's my jam right there. So I would really appreciate getting to know more of you over there. And yeah, like I said at the beginning of the show, if you liked this, consider becoming a guild member, and make sure you are following the Meaning of Catholic on our social media. Hit subscribe, like, and before my co-host Veronica gets any more angry, we will see you next time.